Good morning, four persons, friends, and family. This is the Catholic Ken Apologetics Show with me, your host, Ken Litchfield. We have a great show planned for you today where I will be discussing common questions about the Catholic faith. If you have a question, please leave it in the chat on Facebook or YouTube. If you would like a copy of today's show notes, send me an email at catholicken@the4persons.com. That's Catholic with a K at the4persons.com. I'm also available to come speak at your parish on this or many other topics. You can contact me at kenlitchfield61@gmail.com or look me up on Facebook. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe to this channel. Please share this video with others to help them learn more about the Catholic faith. A comment also helps YouTube to promote this to other people. So let's get started. This first question comes from Pakistan. And why are women required to wear head coverings in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and now they are not? So at the time of Jesus, the cultural custom was that women should cover their heads when going outside to avoid dust and the hot sun. Inside, they would uncover to show their beautiful hair. Covering your hair is a sign of humility. After Vatican II, women were no longer required to wear head coverings, but many are taking up that practice again. Hair is not sinful, but pride is. In Acts chapter 15, we find that the church has the authority to bind and loose disciplines on the members of the church. So if you want to be a member, you also have to submit to the authority of the church that Jesus left behind to carry on his mission. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus gives his apostles the authority to bind and loose. And since they were all Jews at that time, they understood what that meant. The Jewish priests had the authority to give binding rules to all the Jews at that time. They were called halakhic teachings, and halakha means the way you walk. So the temple priests already had the authority to give guidance to the church. And these would be decided in the synagogue and things like that, so that they could let people know what they are supposed to do. And that practice continues today. Many Protestant churches teach that, we use the Bible as our highest authority, but since there are a large variety of Protestant churches, it's obvious that they also use some man's opinion or guidance, the pastor's opinion, which might also be a lady, to actually impose the disciplines on the church. And the members are free to accept or reject those disciplines. But in the Catholic Church, since Jesus left his authority with his apostles, we recognize that our clergy, have the authority to give binding teachings to the members of the church. And just like when you take on a job, the boss has the authority to tell you what to do. If you volunteer in an organization, there's a leader of that organization, and that person coordinates the efforts of the organization. And if you want to be a member of that organization, you have to listen to and follow their direction. If nobody has the authority, then you just have chaos. Somebody has to run the show. And in the Catholic Church, Jesus left his authority with his apostles, who passed it on to their successors. And we find this passing on of authority in Acts chapter 1, where they replace Judas, and Peter even quotes an Old Testament psalm and says, "Let his office another take." In the King James Bible, it even refers to that office as a bishopric. And in 1 Timothy chapter 1, Paul tells Timothy, remember when I laid hands on you. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, Paul again reminds Timothy, remember when I laid hands on you. And in Titus chapter 1, Paul tells Titus, remember when I laid hands on you. And that's how the authority of Paul was passed on to them. And we see this back in Numbers, I think, where Moses passes on his authority to Joshua by laying hands on him. That's how the authority is passed on. And in Titus, Paul tells Titus to teach other men so that they will know the faith correctly, and charge them to go out and teach other men to pass on the faith correctly. So unless you have somebody that can say this is right and this is wrong, then you just have chaos. And at least here in the US, a lot of people, they choose their religion based on their own personal taste, like they choose their favorite ice cream or what they want for dinner. So the next one is, why did God tell Abram to leave the land of Ur? And God tested Abram by telling him to leave without telling him where he was going. Hopefully, God told him what direction to start in, at least. And since Ur is west of, let's see, I think it's south of the land of Israel now, at least you would think that God told him to head south. Although at that time they didn't have compasses, and you couldn't follow a compass that pointed to an S. But anyway, they started going in the right direction, and Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, but he also had to leave the land of Ur. So just believing God is not sufficient. You also have to do what God calls us to do. And God told Abram that if you obey, your descendants will be as great as the stars and the number of stars in the sky and the sands on the seashore. But again, that required that first step into obeying what God called Abram to do. And if you read the story of Abram, that goes from Genesis chapter 15 to Genesis chapter 23, there's a lot of different things that Abram had to do to be in covenant with God. So a mere assent to believing in God is not sufficient according to the Bible. You have to do what God calls us to do in order to be a follower of the one true God. So the next question is, how can the serpent in Genesis chapter 5 be the devil who was made in the beginning? And we need to understand that God is outside of time and space. In the book of Revelation chapter 12, John sees 1/3 of the angels swept away as stars from the sky. Angels were created before the humans, but also were shown that they would be judged by and have to serve humans. Lucifer, and that name means light gatherer, so that's why he gathered 1/3 of the stars from the sky. He gathered up that much light. And 1/3 of the angels followed him in Lucifer's rebellion. And Lucifer appears as a serpent to trick Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 5, but pre-existed all of God's later creation of the universe. So before God created anything in the physical world, he created the angels, and 1/3 of them left and became what we now refer to as demons. And Lucifer is the head demon that we also refer to as Satan. And since these angels are not of this physical world, they can present themselves in this physical world as any kind of physical thing that they would like to be. There's a story of Balaam and his donkey, and his donkey tells Balaam what to do. So, like an angel, you could say an angel spoke to Balaam through his donkey. So that's how the serpent can be the devil in Genesis chapter 5, because Satan can appear to us in many different forms, or his demons. And that's why it's important not to open yourself up to the spiritual world where you might invite in a demon and not an angel. You've been given a guardian angel either at your birth or at your baptism, and that is the one you should follow. That's the one that you should ask for guidance for, and you can ask your guardian angel to intercede with God for you. Don't invite demons into your life, even in what you might think is a game, because you might think it's a game, but they know it's an invitation. So the next question is, Muslims think the Bible we now have is corrupt, but how do we know that it is accurate? And the first thing we need to understand is that the Muhammad, who was illiterate, learned about Christianity in his uncle's trade business. Muhammad was likely influenced by some heretical forms of Christianity. What Muhammad taught was preserved and handed on orally for 20 years before it was written down in 655 AD. After this official copy was made, other partial copies were destroyed to establish a standard text. The Quran tells Muslims to seek the people of the book if they have any questions about the Muslim faith. Since the Bible contradicts what Muslims teach, they have been taught that the Bible was distorted after the time of Muhammad. However, we have copies of the Bible that predate Muhammad, and they agree with our current translations. These copies include the Codex Vaticanus and thousands of other partial manuscripts. So we can rest assured that we have an accurate Bible and that Muhammad's teachings are the corrupted text, not about the Bible. It's easy to make claims, but when you look into the history, you understand what the real truth is. And if you just dig into it a little bit deeper, you find out that the Bible is more accurate than the Quran. So the next question is, do the Jews still set aside virgin women to be the mother of the Messiah? And the answer here is the book of Isaiah is in the Masoretic text, which was translated and assembled between 500 and 900 AD. And it uses a word for young women to be the one who will give birth to the Messiah. Now, I am not aware that any Jewish sects set aside virgins in hope that they will give birth to the Messiah. We know that Jesus is the Messiah that the Jews are still waiting for 2,000 years later. In Matthew chapter 16 and Mark chapter 8, they recount that Jesus makes Peter the rock. In Mark's gospel, Jesus rebukes Peter right after he makes him the rock and tells him that he is Satan. So how do we reconcile these passages? Mark and Matthew's Gospels were written at least 10 years after the ascension of Jesus, and they contain historical data but are not written like a history book. Mark wrote for Peter, and Peter is very humble in admitting his failure right after his appointment as the rock. Jesus' rebuke of Peter shows how Satan can influence us, but God has the power to overcome Satan. Matthew wrote for the Jewish Christians who needed to understand the authoritative structure of their new religion because they were already familiar with the authoritative structure of Judaism. In Matthew chapter 16 and 17, Jesus tells Peter, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah." This is clearly a blessing. In verse 19, Jesus gives Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven and the authority to bind and loose. This is another gift from Jesus. It is therefore logical to recognize that verse 18, which is between verse 17 and 19, is also a blessing when Simon has his name changed to Peter, which means rock. This blessing shows that Peter is the rock that Jesus will build his church on, not just Peter's confession of faith. Verses 17, 18, and 19 all apply to Peter. Jesus does not apply 17 to Peter, 18 to himself or faith in himself, and 19 to Peter again. Now, Protestants like to argue that the Greek word Petra, or little rock, is used for Peter, and the Greek word for big rock, Petros, refers to Peter's faith in Jesus, so that means that Jesus wasn't talking about Peter personally. The Bible was written in Greek, but Jesus spoke Aramaic, and the same word, Kepha, is used for big and little rock. So Jesus was really talking about Peter all three times. We know the Catholic interpretation is correct because the church in Corinth wrote to the church in Rome as early as 70 AD when they had a dispute there. The Corinthians knew where the leader of the church was, there in Rome. The successor to Peter in Rome at that time was Clement, and he wrote a letter back to the church in Corinth and sent a delegation to sort out their problem. Ignatius confirms that the church is centered in Rome in 107 AD, where he writes that the church in Rome presides over Christianity. And in 115 AD, Polycarp goes to the Bishop of Rome when there is a question about which day to celebrate Easter. Polycarp learned the faith from the Apostle John. The Apostle John taught him to celebrate Easter on the 15th of Nisan, according to the Jewish calendar. However, the rest of Christianity was celebrating it on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. And that's why Easter, the date for Easter, moves around today. It's not like Jesus died on different days at different times, but we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus based on the lunar calendar that the Jews follow. But the point here is that Polycarp knew which of the other Christian bishops to go to settle this dispute. He didn't go to the bishop of Antioch. He didn't go to the bishop of Jerusalem. He went to the bishop of Rome. And the bishop of Rome tells Polycarp that you need to celebrate Easter with the rest of us. And Polycarp says that, well, I'm going to follow John and not what you teach. Now, the date that we celebrate Easter was settled at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, and it turns out that the Bishop of Rome was right, and the rest of Christianity was right, and Polycarp was wrong, even though he was following what the Apostle John taught him. Again, it comes down to authority, and the highest authority of the church was there in Rome, and also established by a council. And now the church in Smyrna, which is what we now know as Turkey, Christians there celebrate Easter with the rest of us. And in 180 AD, Irenaeus writes about how if two churches have a dispute, all they have to do is check with the church in Rome to find out the correct teaching, because they have the teaching of Peter and Paul. So again, if you have a dispute on doctrine, check with the church in Rome. That's where the highest authority is. And in Tertullian, when he has a dispute with the Bishop of Rome about the Bishop of Rome forgiving sins, he sends a letter to the Bishop of Rome disputing his authority. But it turns out that Tertullian thought that if you commit one major sin after you become a Christian, you're out and you can never come back. But the Bishop of Rome was teaching that Jesus teaches that we should forgive our brother 70 times 7 or 490 times, which basically means as many times as necessary. And that was the correct teaching in the church. So the next question is, in Pakistan, they use the same word for saint and prophet in the Eucharistic prayer. Someone wondered why Joseph is called a prophet. So this comes down to translation difficulties, and we have the New Testament, well, we have the whole Bible in multiple different languages, and the words, the original Greek words, do not always transfer well one-to-one with a local language. And so translators have to do their best to find an equivalent word in that local language. And even if you're translating from the Latin Vulgate into a local language, again, there might not be a word that transfers one-to-one. A great example of this is the word brother. And many people think of the word brother as, someone who shares the same mother and father as you. But in English, yes, we have that understanding of the word brother, somebody who has the same parents as you do. However, we have fraternal groups, which are like a family, even though we are not related biologically. We refer to each other as brothers and sisters because we try to operate as a family. And even in union organizations, they refer to each other as brother and sister, even though they do not share the same biological parents. So this idea that the word brother only means that you are of the same mother and father is not correct understanding. The word brother in English can mean many different things. And we also need to understand that in Aramaic, they didn't have a word for cousin. When you referred to a cousin, you had to say, like, the son of my uncle, or the son of my father's brother. Or they would just use the word brother because they all operated like a large family, even though they did not have the same, mother and father biologically. Perhaps they all had the same great, 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 great grandfather and grandmother. And so in that way, they considered themselves brothers and sisters. And this word saint and prophet can also cause translation problems too. Prophets generally refer to the men in the Old Testament that spoke on the behalf of God. And the way that the Jews determined if the prophet was a true spokesman for God is, do their predictions actually come true? And the Old Testament records, many teachings from the prophets that did come true. And it also records for us the fact that many of the prophets were stoned to death or exiled because the people didn't want to listen to them. Again, people have free will and sometimes choose to not follow what God calls us to do. And when somebody tries to correct us that says they are speaking for God, they don't want to listen to them. And that's why we need to keep in mind that God sends us good guidance, and he can send us good guidance through men in the church. And if we sign up to be a Catholic, we sign up to obey what the church teaches and to receive guidance from our clergy, from our local priest to our local bishop to the Pope and the cardinals that work with the Pope. So moving on to the next question, in Revelation chapter 22 and Corinthians chapter 6 and Galatians chapter 5, it says that drunkards can't enter heaven. So why do Catholic priests and other Catholics drink wine and other alcoholic drinks? So alcohol by itself is not bad, just like any food is not bad. But too much food is bad because that's gluttony, which is a sin that can keep you out of heaven. And too much alcohol is also bad for us, which can make us drunk. So we don't have to be afraid to use food and alcohol, but we do need to use them wisely. Getting drunk is a sin because it hurts us when we are members of the body of Christ through baptism. We don't want to hurt the body, and we can also more easily engage in other sinful activity if we are drunk. So we should avoid too much alcohol, but alcohol alone is okay. In 2 Timothy chapter 5, Paul tells Timothy to use a little wine in water for the sake of his stomach. And Jews use wine and alcohol as medicine, and also in their mini Passover meals on Friday and the major Passover meal where they celebrate the Passover, which was when the Jews, right before the Jews left Egypt, when the angel of the Lord came and destroyed the firstborn, except for the Jews that had marked their doorposts with the blood of the Lamb. So this next question comes from Facebook, and it is, why do modern Christians only have one wife when Abraham, David, and Solomon had multiple wives? Well, first of all, Abraham only had one wife, Sarah. Hagar was his wife's maidservant, and Sarah offered her to Abraham in hope of fulfilling God's plan through her, who gave birth to Ishmael. It was not God's plan, which he did fulfill through Sarah after giving birth to Isaac. So the understanding at that time was that Hagar, being the assistant to Sarah, her maidservant, was so intimately connected to Sarah that she was like an extension of Sarah. And since for year after year after year, Sarah did not become pregnant and fulfill what God's promise to Abraham, she thought that perhaps it was God's plan to fill that promise through Hagar. But no, that was not God's plan. God was testing them, and well after the time that Abraham and Sarah should have been able to have children, he gave them Isaac. Now, Moses tells the Israelites to take a brother's wife if the man dies to raise up children for him. A woman without a man has no rights in Jewish society. Women are in covenant with God through their father or their husband, through his circumcision. A baptism in the New Testament allows women and men to be in covenant with God. David took Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, even though he already had a wife. This was a sin, and God punished both of them by letting their baby die. Solomon carried on the tradition of multiple wives to the extreme and had 700 wives and 300 concubines. This is perhaps an exaggeration, but still too many wives. From this, we get the idea of the Queen Mother, though, who in Solomon's case was Bathsheba, because a king with so many wives has only one mother. And the Queen Mother intercedes for the children of the king and even the brothers and sisters of the king. And this is the same relationship that Jesus has with Mary. Jesus is the Messiah that sits on the throne of David, and Mary is his mother. And that's why we recognize Mary as the Queen of Heaven. And we see her in Revelation chapter 12. And at the end of Revelation chapter 11, John is looking into heaven and he sees the Ark of the Covenant. And people think, oh, that's that box that the Jews held the Ten Commandments and the manna and Aaron's staff in. But no, we read on in the first verse of chapter 12 that the ark is not a box, it's a woman. And that is a woman that gives birth to the man-child that rules with a rod of iron, which is Jesus. And the serpent tries to attack her. And the woman is crowned with a crown of 12 stars and has the moon at her feet. So that's how we know Mary is the Queen Mother, the Queen in heaven. She's Jesus' mother, and the tradition was that the successor to David would have his queen as mother. And we see that throughout the Bible, and even the Jewish tribes, the Israelites, 10 tribes that broke away from the two southern tribes, also had the Queen Mother as queen with whoever was king. Now, in the Catholic Church today, we only allow one wife at a time. because Jesus says that this is the way it was from the beginning with Adam and Eve. Now, Paul also tells us that if your spouse dies, you are free to marry, but he also recommends that you remain single like he is, so that you can better serve others in the church. And also, in Genesis, it tells us that Abraham married Keturah, but this was after Sarah had died. So the Old Testament does teach that Abraham had more than one wife, but not all together. The next question is, why does the Catholic Church teach that homosexual activity is a sin? And in Genesis chapter 1, God tells Adam and Eve to be fruitful and to multiply. Two people of the same sex cannot multiply no matter what parts they stick in each other's body. Genesis chapter 9 tells us about the sinful people of Sodom, where the men want to engage in sexual activity with other men of Lot's group. And that kind of sexual activity might be entertaining, but it has no chance of actually being fruitful and creating another human being. God created us male and female with different parts so that we could reproduce and be fruitful and multiply. And that is the ultimate purpose of the sexual act. And the reason that all sexual acts have to be finished with an act that has the potential for reproduction. And now, it doesn't mean that every time you have sex, you're going to have a baby, and it doesn't mean that you can't have sex after menopause, or even if a woman has a hysterectomy and has her uterus removed. It just means that sexual activity has to be finished with an act that has the potential for producing more human beings. Okay, in Genesis chapter 3, the snake is bad by tempting Adam and Eve. In Numbers chapter 21, snake bites the sinful Israelites and they die. And then God tells Moses to make a bronze image of a snake, and they are healed by looking at it. The snake is bad again in Revelation chapter 12. So is the snake good or bad? And the thing is, like, to broadly label a snake as a good or a bad thing is not fair to the snakes. In the natural environment, snakes do have a purpose. They eat other small creatures or plants, and they reproduce also. They're all part of God's plan for our environment. So to say that all snakes are bad or all snakes are good is not being fair to the snakes. And just like humans can do good or bad things, a snake can do good or bad things. And you might think that a snake eating another animal is a bad thing, but for the snake, he thinks that's a good thing because that's how he gets food to eat. And like, if you were to say, Judas betrayed Jesus, so all humans are bad, that's not being fair to the rest of the humans. But in Genesis chapter 3, God describes the snake as the evil. Well, the devil possesses the snake and tempts Adam and Eve. And God curses the snake after that and tells him that he will crawl on his belly and eat dust. But not all snakes eat dust now. So the next question is, why don't priests marry? Jesus and Paul tell us that celibacy is the better way. Most Catholic clergy are free to put their church family first. They don't have to choose between a church event or their child's event. A local church does not have to provide as much money for a single priest as it does for a minister and his family. Also, a Catholic priest has the freedom to teach the truth about the Catholic faith without worrying about his congregation firing him for teaching something they don't like. Some Catholic clergy are married, but most are Anglican converts. And it is only the Roman rite of the Catholic Church that expects its priests to be celibate. The other 22 rites of the Catholic Church do allow for married priests, but bishops do have to be celibate. And the Orthodox Church also allows priests to marry, but bishops are required to be celibate. God wants Christians to marry and multiply, but clergy are called to a higher state of life. Now, some Protestants will say that all bishops or church leaders need to be married and have just one wife, based on Paul's recommendation to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 3. But Paul was dealing with Timothy in the situation that they were in at that time, where there wasn't a lot of single celibate men around. And the temple priests, they had to abstain from sex while they were serving in the temple. Since Catholic priests serve in the temple of God, the church, every day, it's better for them to be celibate and be prepared to serve God in a holy manner, just like the temple priests did at the time of Jesus. Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 19, verse 12, for there are some eunuchs which were so from birth and from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men, and there may be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. So here Jesus is talking about men who are willing to forego a wife and a family in order to better serve God. And that's what we call our priests to do. In Paul's first letter to the Corinthians in chapter 7, he tells them, I wish that all were as I myself am. And at that time, Paul was single. But each has his own special gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is well for them to remain single, as I do. So if bishops have to be married, Paul would not qualify to be a bishop. But we know that being single and serving the church is a higher calling, not a curse. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is well for them to remain single as I do. Several times in this chapter, Paul comes down on the side of saying that virginity is better if you have not already married. Paul concludes with verse 38, so that he who marries his betrothed does well, but he who refrains from marriage will do better. In the first century of the church, there were not a lot of single men to be ordained as bishops. And this is why Paul tells Timothy to look for men with one wife to ordain as bishops. Paul, Luke, Timothy, Titus, Barnabas, Mark, and the Apostle John were all single. A single man does not have to worry about dying for the sake of Christianity. A married man has to think about how his death would affect his family. So even though both Jesus and Paul tell us that celibacy is the better way, this does not mean that marriage is bad. Marriage is part of the church that helps create the future church. For clergy, celibacy allows them to devote their lives in service to the church, like a husband is supposed to devote his life in service to his wife, and she likewise to him. At the time of Jesus, a woman was in covenant with God through her father or husband. Even though Mary planned on leading a celibate life, she needed a husband to be in covenant with God. Only men could be in covenant with God because only men can be circumcised, which was the symbol that showed that you were in covenant with God. Baptism, which is available to all, is the new sign of being in covenant with God. There were not a lot of single men available in the early church, so Paul instructs Timothy to find a good man with only one wife to become the new clergy in the church. Also at this time, when you could be killed for being a Christian, it was good for the clergy to be celibate so that they did not have to worry about leaving a wife and children behind when they were killed for the faith. 60 years after the beginning of Christianity, we were on our third pope because the previous two were killed for the faith. Third pope, St. Clement, was exiled and then killed for being the head of the church. And I wonder how many married men would sign up to be ministers if they knew there was a good chance of being killed for the faith, like they did. Priestly celibacy is the general rule in the Latin Roman Rite of the Catholic Church. There are some Latin Roman Rite Catholic priests who are married, but most are single so that they can serve their churches better. The Eastern Rite churches do allow their priests to be married, like the Orthodox priests can be married. In the Eastern Rite Catholic Church and Orthodox churches, bishops are celibate and usually come from the monasteries, where the monks take on a vow of celibacy anyway. The Catholic Church does not teach that marriage is bad. The Catholic Church teaches that celibacy is better. There has always been a deep human intuition that celibacy brings great spiritual gifts, a heightened sensitivity to divine things. Even under the Old Covenant, a married priest had to be celibate while he served in the temple, performing the duties of a priest. Moses asked that the Jews abstain from conjugal sex while he ascended Mount Sinai, and the prophet Jeremiah was forbidden by God to take a wife in order that he might fulfill his ministry. The apostles and their successors had freedom of choice in this matter, at least until the 4th century, and when a large number of the clergy during this period did choose celibacy. There is a tradition that after their calling by Christ, those apostles who were married lived as though they were not. St. Jerome speaks of a general custom in the late 4th century when he declares that clerics, even though they may have wives cease to be husbands. Several early fathers, including Tertullian, Origen, Eusebius, Hilary, and Epiphanius, wrote favorably about celibacy. It was the local council of Alvira in Spain, which was held between 295 and 302 AD, where celibacy was first imposed on bishops, priests, and deacons. The practice was held as the ideal for clergy, but was implemented in a piecemeal fashion in various locations until it was decreed church-wide for all clergy in the First Lateran Council in 1123 AD. Reforming popes like Pope Leo IX and Gregory VII insisted that henceforth the priesthood should be celibate. On October 1st, 1529, we have the Colloquy of Marburg, which attempted to unify the followers of Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli. And it would close in failure on October 4th. While the reformers agreed on 14 of the 15 articles, they remained divided over the Lutheran doctrine of the Eucharist, which was consubstantiation. Martin Luther believed that Jesus is present with and around the elements of the Eucharist. Therefore, Switzerland remained Reformed and Germany remained Lutheran, and dreams of a united European front against the Roman Catholic Church died since this issue. In Luther's later years, the Protestants have been splitting ever since. And so the point of that is that for there to be unity in the church, there has to be somebody that says, this is the way we're going to do it, and this is not the way we're going to do it. And that authority has to be imposed on everybody else who wants to be a member of that church. In our modern times, so many people want to do their own thing and follow their own decisions. So therefore, they don't want to listen to the disciplines imposed by their local church. And if a Protestant doesn't like what their local church teaches or how they do things, well, they just go find another church that they do agree with. But in the Catholic Church, we have standards that our clergy are expected to follow and disciplines that the church imposes on us as Catholics. And if we want to be a Catholic in good standing, we have to listen to the church and do what the church tells us to do. Now, the church does not do that to just boss us around. The church does that for our own good. And if you find out why the church teaches what the church does, you find out, yes, in the end, it is for our own good. So, thanks for tuning in today. If you found this show useful, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to the Four Persons Incorporated using the donation tab on our homepage. If you would like a copy of today's show notes or have a follow-up question, send me an email at catholicken@thefourpersons.com or look me up on Facebook. If you're watching this on YouTube or Facebook, please like and share this video. Also, make sure you are subscribed on YouTube for more great content coming soon. If you'd like to have me come speak at your parish on this or many other topics, you can send me an email at kenlichfield61@gmail.com or look me up on Facebook. May God bless and guide your efforts to bring the truth of the Catholic faith to the world. Bye now.